Thaddeus Squire has more than 20 years of experience in the nonprofit management field, focusing on arts and cultural heritage. Thaddeus's creative practice has focused on systems designed for nonprofit resource sharing, in particular, practices based in commoning and commons management principles. Thaddeus currently works as the Chief Commons Steward at Social Impact Commons.
That was a lot of commons. I've never read that text out loud. So, well, thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Since we've got a fairly discrete group, I thought it would be good and just helpful for me to understand key questions or interests among those who are joining today. If we could just do brief intros, name, preferred pronoun, and why this session was interesting to you, or what key question or questions are you looking to answer or come away with some potential answers from today. So would anybody like to kick things off?
I can go first.
Okay. Sure.
My name is Angela McQuillan. I'm the program manager at Venture Cafe, and I've been working at the Science Center for about 7 years now. So it's a nonprofit company, and I feel like you have some really great insights on what a nonprofit is, what it's supposed to be, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing all about it.
Great. We can just go down the list. I don't know if Arnab, if you want to go through the rest of your team and just throw a question or point of interest on the table.
Yeah, sure. My name is Arnab Sarkar. I'm a high school student at Unionville High School. I'm in 11th grade, and I'm at Venture Cafe here. I'm an ambassador, and like volunteer ambassador. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot about the nonprofit sector in this presentation.
All right. All right. Pamela?
I am Pamela Blanding Godfold, and I am with the Good Network. And as we sat with a business consultant, he has advised that the type of business that we're looking to do should more than likely be a nonprofit, co-op, which sounds like two totally different things. So as we look to do that pivot, I want to have a better idea and most importantly, connect with some people who may be able to help navigate that process. And I literally just saw this in my email 3 minutes ago. Like it just popped up. I was in my email. So I guess I'm like really supposed to be here. This is the first thing that I saw on the list of things. I had it long enough to send it to friends and jump on myself.
Great. Well, welcome, Lorraine.
Yeah, I am the CFO for the Science Center, and I have experience in the nonprofit sector as well. We are going through our strategic planning process right now, so I'll be very interested, to hear all the perspectives, the public sector, the government as well.
Great. Ashley? Ashley, you're muted if you're talking. Might come back to Ashley. Bob? Just want to give everybody a chance. If you don't want to introduce, that's fine too. Felipe? Just curious about the questions in the room before we start.
Hi, Philip. I have no specific questions. I work in education technology, so that's already kind of in between for-profit and not-for-profit stuff. Also doing some current work on a project that is explicitly nonprofit, so I'm just kind of interested in hearing a little bit more about your perspectives.
Kiki? About Lynette?
So I'm Lynette Moore. I'm the director of Quorum at the Science Center, and I have, gosh, over 12 years experience in the nonprofit world. Started off with a small organization in Seattle and worked there during, in any small nonprofit, you wear many hats, but did a lot of fundraising and program management. And then worked for a donor advice fund for a few years, which is a nonprofit, but it's definitely different type of nonprofit. And started off at the Science Center in fundraising, and now I oversee our event space and programming. So
Great. And I guess, 1 second here. Sophie.
Hey, yes, I work in service design and UX research in the nonprofit industry, bouncing around Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York.
Cool, great. I've lost track of my list. Does anybody else want to identify and put an interest or question on the table? Otherwise, we'll jump in. And I'm sure I've missed some folks.
I can actually introduce myself. I'm so sorry, my audio wasn't connected there.
No worries, go ahead.
But my name is Kiki Levy. I'm a current student at Temple University. I'm a part of the IME program, so Innovation Management and Entrepreneurship. Well, my pronouns are she and her. I received the email and I'm like, hey, this is like a perfect segue to everything that I'm learning currently in my program. So I don't have any specific questions, but I'm really excited about the information that you plan on sharing with us today.
Alrighty, welcome. Anybody else?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey. I recently graduated from Penn with a master's in city planning, where I looked at a lot of these kinds of questions in the built environment of how nonprofit and profit and government sectors can all interact. And I work now as a consultant partially for the City of Philadelphia's quasi-public economic development agency, where we work with private sector and the City of Philadelphia, state and federal partners to, promote economic development throughout the city of Philadelphia. So I was kind of with a lot of other people, saw this in my inbox today and was like, today's one I got to log in for. So excited to be here and thank you.
Great. All right, maybe one or two more if they are such, and we'll just dive in. Okay, perfect. Yeah, just thank you very much. That just gives me a sense of kind of a range of folks in the room. I am going to share my screen, and I have about 15 minutes, hopefully, if I speak efficiently, of presentation, and then we will open the floor for some more questions. I realize we have a pretty diverse kind of group today, coming at this from various levels of familiarity. So if this is old information, hopefully it'll be a nice refresher. If you get lost or completely perplexed, feel free to raise a hand or even just raise your voice, since we have a pretty small group. That's fine, and ask a clarifying question. But just know as we go through this, we will have some time for Q&A and discussion to address specific things. Also, I am happy to share this deck publicly. It's not private information, so don't worry about screenshotting or scribbling too much. All of this stuff can be made available. I think, is that correct? Is that possible through you all at the Science Center and Venture Cafe?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm happy to do it if there's a means to do it. Okay, let me share here. And all right, here we are. Do we have visuals? Okay, great. So welcome. Our topic today is the nonprofit sector and my organizations, as well as a growing community of folks in the nonprofit world, our view and desire to essentially return our sector to what we see as its roots in commoning and commons, and I'll talk about what those two words mean in very short order. And how the nonprofit sector can work in concert with the private sector and government to advance social good and community benefit in the United States. I will say, as a little bit of clarifying point in terms of my own perspective and my organization's perspective. I'm a healthy critic of free market capitalism, particularly in the sort of more neoliberal form it's taken today. And I'm obviously a great advocate for the nonprofit sector and commoning. As a complement to that, I'm not anti-capitalist per se. I do believe the free markets and private ownership, private asset management has a place in the world. I do think that there are places where it does more harm than good, and a healthy balance and sense of separation and division of labor between the sectors is what we really want to achieve. So I just wanted to lay that out there. I'm often talking to folks on one political side of the spectrum or the other when it comes to these sectoral issues. So just want to put that out there. So our goals for today are to really understand what at its basic core is a nonprofit organization, a bit of where nonprofits in this country come from historically, legally, why we have this sector kind of to begin with, how the sector differs from the private sector and government, with which nonprofits are often confused. A lot of folks feel that nonprofits are the same as government or are part of government, and that's not exactly true. And then to go over some key considerations, I think per Pamela's questions around what are the deciding factors between nonprofit, for-profit, or even dual sector approaches where you're working in both nonprofit and for-profit to advance whatever social change or business goals you have. The goal here is not to elevate one over the other, but understand the differences and the considerations in choosing from one for the other. So this is neither a booster for the private sector nor a booster for the nonprofit sector, but just understanding how they work together. And then finally, if we have some time, I'm happy to talk about a sort of an alternative to going out and forming your own nonprofit if that's the right route for you. And that is fiscal sponsorship, which is sort of my focus and day job. I come from the fiscal sponsorship field, and I'm working on building a national nonprofit at the moment to build capacity for the fiscal sponsorship field. So happy to talk about that. So first of all, at a very basic level, what's a nonprofit? It's a bit of a misnomer, as many of you know. Nonprofits have been defined largely over and against the for-profit sector, hence the name nonprofit. And I think there are a lot of problems and unfortunate ramifications of that way they've been defined. But in short, a nonprofit is an organization that holds and governs assets that are in public trust. Resources that be they services, programs, could be real estate, any kind of asset or resource, natural lands, etc. Those resources have to benefit the general public, and specifically under nonprofit law, nonprofit resources are built of and for legally the citizens of the state in which that nonprofit is formed and is active. There are, of course, national nonprofits that then are operating in multiple states and whose resources benefit citizens of multiple states. But in the United States, the nonprofit sector really is kind of defined on a state-by-state basis, even though it seeks its exemption from the federal government. But in short, these are public trust assets. These are things that are not privately held, nor are they owned by government, but they're there to benefit our communities. Frequently and increasingly today, particularly with the robust conversation we're having around social justice and economic equality and equity, the nonprofit sector catches a lot of flack. A lot of folks, particularly if they're coming from the for-profit side, say, I don't want to get into nonprofit because it's kind of painful and screwed up and has all these problems. And I will admit the nonprofit sector itself has a lot of challenges today, structurally. And we root a lot of those challenges in the fact that the nonprofit sector is largely managed the way you would manage private assets or private businesses. And while those management principles aren't wrong per se, they're misapplied in the nonprofit sector. So a lot of the ills that we suffer from in the nonprofit sector and complain about are a result of basically the wrong tools for the job, if you will, in terms of management and how we think about the sector's assets. And so, my work and real passion is how we can kind of bring in new tools, better tools to manage the nonprofit sector, better frameworks, and keep private asset and free market principles where they belong, namely in the free market. It's tough in this country because we are dominated, I don't need to say, by capitalist and free market values and assumptions. I encounter people every day who can't imagine spending their life developing a resource or asset that they don't own. But I'm one of those people. At least for the last 25 years, everything I've created, which is now 4 nonprofits and counting, I don't have any personal private ownership in. I have different personal motives for doing that, and we'll talk about that because that's really at the core of a lot of these decisions. So our solution to this problem of why the nonprofit sector suffers from a lot of challenges in management and structure is to really go back to its roots in commoning and the commons. And so, quick definition: a commons is a defined but open group of people. So first of all, commons are about people, not necessarily the things or the stuff. So it's a group of people who are actively engaged, have a set of rules, principles through which they manage and govern, but they govern a set of shared resources that benefits the group. Those resources are not necessarily owned by the group. They are just managed by the group. And that's a key distinction. Any resource really can be commonized. As I said, it can be land, it can be staff. Fiscal sponsors are basically shared staff for nonprofits, back office staff, if you want to look at them that way. Technology, intellectual property, money, any asset can be commonized, provided it sort of meets this definition. Commoning itself, and I'll share with you some of the lingo. It has a vast literature and field of research to it. It has its own language as well, which we're trying to kind of make a little bit more, less imposing. But commoning is just the activity of governing commons, and these are things that have existed for thousands of years. Commoning and commons themselves are very ancient ideas. They exist in practically every culture, or an idea of commoning exists in practically every culture around the world. It's one of the few sort of transcultural, multicultural notions of human resource management out there. And the terminology and ideas that I'll be using today come from some more contemporary sort of commons principles. Commoning is very close to cooperatives. There are some differences that are significant. But a lot of the principles, admittedly, are very, very similar. So if you're familiar with co-ops and cooperative management, there's a lot of affinity there. So to put this all in context, really we've got 3 sectors out there, and these are often confused or misunderstood. From where I sit, any healthy economy, particularly the economy and society of the United States, really needs 3 separate but integrated sectors. So these are 3 distinct ways of working and ways of managing resources, none of which is about superiority over the other, but really need to work together to create a healthy society and healthy country. So one is the state government, and that exists, of course, in this country at federal, state, and local levels. I've included here some of the sort of key comparative attributes. So the state collects taxes. It also can earn revenue. It does work and can earn income from that. It's governed by legislatures and has its own sort of checks and balances in terms of the governmental branches that we maintain in the United States Constitution. On the other side of the spectrum, there's the private sector, which most of us are familiar with at one level or another. It can earn income. You have to pay taxes on that. Sometimes it's governed by a board of directors if it's publicly traded. Much of the sector is privately held, to use that term, doesn't have a separate board and is not traded on stock markets. It has checks and balances in the form of the attorneys general, and regulatories and taxing authorities. In the middle sits the nonprofit sector, and it's sometimes called the third sector. That's a somewhat old but popular term for it. Our term calling it a common sector is really specific to kind of my work and the work of my colleagues. This is not a term that's in popular use. Most people use nonprofit when they talk about the tax exempt sector. It collects donations to bring money in. It also can earn tax-free income and under its tax exemption. It's governed by boards at the local level. Each organization has to have a board. And it too has checks and balances. There are charitable regulators, and the common sector answers to the state's attorney general. So just to lay these out, there are assets that are owned, managed by government, which include public property, lots of infrastructure, highways, bridges, things of that nature. There's private asset management, which takes every imaginable form. And then there's commons assets that can be anything practically the private sector manages, but are managed under this middle kind of ownership concept. Just to do a brief history, and I'm a little bit of a history geek on this subject, but it helps to put this in context in the West, at least. The notion of commoning, I mentioned, is very ancient. In our contemporary sort of legal and corporate context, it has its roots back to Justinian in the 6th century AD. Justinian was a Roman emperor. He was charged with organizing this incredibly vast and disparate set of laws because the empire had grown very large at that point. And the way he did that was to organize ownership, start with ownership ideas. And he created actually 4 buckets of ownership. There was res publica, which were things that were owned by the state, so equivalent to our government today. There was res privatae, things that were owned by private citizens. They didn't really have corporate concepts back then, but they were owned by private people. And then there was res communes, or common things that were resources that were governed and stewarded for a particular community, like the citizens of Rome. These had their own ownership class. Just for kicks, and it's one of my favorite things, Justinian had a 4th notion that we've dropped almost altogether today called res nullius, which are things that nobody owns. And in Roman time, that was the sky and the oceans and air and things of that nature. So there was this notion that there's stuff that nobody can possibly own, which I think is really fascinating. Unfortunately, today, pretty much everything can be privately owned, and that's part of our problem, I think. As you move this concept forward, we learn about in high school the Magna Carta and King John. We don't learn the fact that there was an addendum that called Charter of the Forest that was about natural lands management in England at that time, which was really a commons management concept, the way the Magna Carta was laid out. In the 16th century, we start to get evidence of what is our contemporary, our modern economy with private ownership and privatization under King Henry VIII. And this concept of enclosure, which literally means taking a resource like a piece of real estate or a piece of livestock, if you will, and owning it privately, sort of enclosing it both literally and figuratively for that private owner's benefit, nobody else's. And from that point on, there's a volatile history of relationship between the state, the private sector, and the common sector, sort of organizing how all those resources get managed and stewarded. Last thing I'll mention, Queen Elizabeth I, 1601, is really the first person to come up with a modern notion of nonprofit or charitable use, and writes the Charitable Uses Act in 1601. That act is the same set of legal principles that govern the nonprofit sector in America today. So our Charitable Uses Act that we use today is virtually verbatim to 1601, the act that was created by Elizabeth I. We pulled it into the United States as we pulled a lot of English law over during the colonial period. Into the 19th and 20th century, commoning really took off alongside the cooperative movements with its sort of most significant figure being Eleanor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel in economics for essentially modernizing what's called common pool resource economics, which is now a subfield of economics, and talks about how we manage commons. Her principles that she identified are virtually the same principles employed by the nonprofit sector for its management. And that sort of brings this story full circle to where we are today with the nonprofit sector, where we have government, we have private, and in between those two things, there's this third rail, this third domain where resources are governed in common. So to bring this into practical relief, you know, one of my nonprofits that's organized in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, all of its assets, all of the cash in its bank account, everything that it manages are technically the property of the people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That is why all nonprofits answer to the Attorney General of the state in which they're formed, and have a governing board, because both the board and the Attorney General represent the interest of the people of that state relative to the resources you are governing for their benefit. So if I'm providing services, there's the answer, you're answerable essentially to the people of that state or the states where you operate if you are national or regional in your scope. So that's a very important definition that I'm going to underscore a couple times, that I venture to say a lot of people working in the nonprofit sector don't quite understand, including many boards. You know, my experience with boards of nonprofits is they govern nonprofits the way they would a private company, and think about the assets as sort of enclosed or specific to their nonprofit. They really aren't. They may be titled to that nonprofit in a local sense, but in a true sense, they're owned by the people of the state in which that nonprofit works. So this history, if we set aside government, you know, leaves us with sort of two coexisting frameworks other than government, the private capitalist framework and the commons or social framework. And these are characterized by some very different ways of viewing the world in many ways. And again, I'm not placing at the moment values on either of these. I'm just saying these are sort of the differences between these two sectors. One sort of starts with a sense of real radical individualism. Again, I can own this. This is mine. Nobody else can access it. Versus the commons world, which is much more open and communal, open source, if you will, to use the sort of tech term. And actually open source communities are one of the prototypical commons notions. So those of you that know the tech community and open source work, they're one of the go-to commons models out there. I mean, or I should say they're a manifestation of that. There's much more relational value placed on relation and connectedness in the commons world per se than the capitalist world, which is much more transactional. And the way we think about assets and ownership and wealth building are also fundamentally different. One, again, in an enclosed private sense, the other in a sense that it's for a defined but open group of people, like the citizens of a particular state. So a few myths about nonprofits, focusing in a little bit on the nonprofit side of things. So nonprofit assets and resources owned by government. These are some things that come up a lot that I just wanted to kind of clarify. They're not owned by government. They are overseen and regulated by government, but then again, so are private enterprises as well. Nonprofit is a bad business model. We've all heard about the nonprofit model, or model gets used with nonprofit a lot. There is no model of nonprofit. Nonprofit is a tax status, and that is it. Nonprofits have as many business models as for-profits have. There's a vast range of the way value is earned and income is received and capitalization is done in both nonprofit and for-profit enterprise. So it's just a tax status, not a business model. Often here as a nonprofit, I can't earn any money, which is false. Nonprofits can earn as much money as they wish, provided it's invested in mission and the people behind those missions. Salaries, and these are questions I often get from people starting nonprofits that are concerns or things that they're really worried about or questioning. Salaries and earning potential are highly constrained only in a limited fashion. Now, it is true that on average, salaries in the nonprofit sector are below many for-profit areas of earning that may be considered equivalent. But there is no legal limit on you earning a market level wage. I mean, the president of the University of Pennsylvania makes something around $3 million a year in salary. And the University of Pennsylvania is a 501c3 nonprofit. There are large hospitals that I could present as a similar case. If you can demonstrate market parity for your salary or wage, you can earn well and you can earn it. There's not really as many constraints on that as folks believe, other than just economic, other than whether you can pay yourself that much money. Nonprofits are subject to more regulation. It's a common myth as well. Nonprofits do answer to a taxing authority. You have to file federal tax returns just like any business would. And it has its own regulatory authority similar to the SEC. But then again, the for-profit sector is also regulated and answers to taxing authorities. So it's a little bit of a myth that there's more regulation in one than the other. At this point, in this country, I would actually argue that there is far less regulation in the nonprofit sector than in the for-profit sector, largely because there are many states that don't regulate at all, and the federal government is not very hands-on in terms of its management of the nonprofit sector. Boards come up and control a lot in conversations. Nonprofits do have to have boards. You can't operate a nonprofit just by yourself. But then again, publicly traded companies have boards that serve similar watchdog and governance purposes. Of course, if you're privately held, if you're not publicly traded as a for-profit, you have a lot of discretion and you don't answer to a board. So there's no argument there. If you're looking for complete sort of private control, there's nothing like private ownership and close ownership, not publicly traded. So there's just a few of the kind of common misunderstandings. In considering the nonprofit, for-profit world, and I've, being in the fiscal sponsorship field, been around a lot of startups in the social impact, broadly in the social impact, social innovation space. And it's a very common decision at the outset. Do I do nonprofit, for-profit, some combination of both? And these are sort of some of the key considerations that we believe are at stake when considering one or the other. And again, there's not really a right or wrong answer in that decision. It really depends on how you feel about these issues that are on the slide here, and where you fall and what your goals are. And I will note that a lot of the answers to these questions, particularly for founders and startups, are deeply personal. And you shouldn't apologize or feel bad about that, because sometimes it is a question of like, I individually as a founder want to own this thing privately, or I as a founder don't really have interest in owning this. I just want to do this and earn a living. That fundamental sort of two-path option is where the conversation sits a lot with individual founders or even groups of founders. And so let me dive into that a little bit more deeply. So I'm here just juxtaposing the commons nonprofit sector and the private sector. I'll note that both of these sectors do business with and relate to the government, each in their own way. So both have robust relationships with government as a source of funding and other resources. So values and beliefs. If you really believe in sort of cooperative and open source processes, there are a lot of folks where that's a value, and that's where innovation happens. Nonprofit and commons may be for you. If you're a firm believer that it's competitive free markets that create innovation, maybe you're happier in the private sector. And these are, I'm not here to argue the merits and demerits of either, but these are definitely two schools of thought and belief. Some people hold both, but that's a particular, so your approach to innovation and where you think it comes from matters. Scale. how do you achieve scale? Is it through intentional community building and sharing things in common? If that's really where you sit, nonprofit may be for you. If you're really interested in market competition, market making, and that mode of scale and growing your business, that's squarely sort of a private notion. I'll note that that concept of competitive advantage often gets applied in the nonprofit sector, which I think is completely incoherent and leads to kind of useless conversations. I'm happy to talk about that later. But these are two different models of scale and how markets are built. Finally, sort of management, are you interested in sharing stewardship and having sort of public accountability, or are you more interested in not having that and remaining privatized? And if anything, having shareholder accountability, for instance, in the case of publicly traded companies. Finance, this is where things get a little interesting. One of the key comparative considerations we find is thinking about capital and how you're going to capitalize your business or enterprise or social venture. Nonprofits can take on debt, just like for-profits can. The difference is a lot of the debt, nonprofits have access to lower cost debt compared to for-profit businesses. There's some rather unique kinds of debt available to nonprofits that are not largely available to for-profit businesses. Equity is possible, though it's rare or rarer in the nonprofit sector because it requires some legal complexity, whereas equity is a very common way of capitalizing and resourcing a for-profit venture. One of the key distinctions is really in grants and contributions. Obviously, nonprofits can receive those and use those as capital, which is often how they're used. There are grants for-profit companies, but they're far fewer. And it's a less common, if you will, mode of capitalization. But it's often called non-recoverable capital because it's capital you get and you don't have to give it back. That's what that means. So a grant is a thing a funding you get from a philanthropy that you don't have to repay. Income is actually a little bit more diverse on the nonprofit side because you can have both earned incomes, so income from goods and services, and you can have contributions. For-profits can only have essentially earned income sources and streams. One's tax exempt, the other's taxable, of course. Ownership and wealth building also have, in keeping with these other comparisons, different dynamics, which I'm happy to delve into. So I want to pause here. I have some additional kind of back matter that we can dive into if there's interest, but this is really, I think, the bottom line or the core considerations that one needs to take into thought when looking at nonprofit versus for-profit. There are many, and I'm seeing this increasingly, for-profit undertakings that have a nonprofit partner or sort of tandem venture. There is really no hybrid from a tax status. There's a lot of talk out there about hybrid models, and what people mostly mean is a for-profit and nonprofit working in tandem or in some sort of partnership with each other, but you're either on one side of the tax line or you're on the other. There is no gray area in taxable or tax exempt, just to be clear. But you can play with building. You can play in both sandboxes, if you will, and many people do, and that's how they can kind of reap the best of both worlds, depending on what their goals are at the end of the day. So, with that, I'm happy to open the floor to questions and conversation.
I have a question. When you spoke about playing possibly in both sandboxes, where could you expand a little bit more on how people are doing that, and if there are a lot of people that's kind of in that blurred line of being illegal in what they're doing and being safely on the legal side of things?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. So there does need to be kind of legal and tax clarity. So there may be folks who play push the boundaries of nonprofit inappropriately into kind of private or for-profit world, and vice versa. But it's important to keep the nonprofit and the for-profit world separate. And the best way to do that is to actually have them under separate legal formations, corporations, entities, whatever it is you form. And knowing that, and keeping the activities and assets you're building on both of those sides also kind of clearly separate, because they have very different compliance and other regulatory obligations. So sort of keeping church and state clearly separate is important, but you can coordinate. And I'll give you an example. When I was running, I started a arts and culture fiscal sponsor in Philly, and a fiscal sponsor is basically a nonprofit that is an umbrella or a condominium for other independent nonprofits that share common infrastructure. So mostly back office, tax status, legal infrastructure. In Philly, there's Urban Affairs Coalition, Public Health Management Corp. Those are all fiscal sponsors if you're familiar with them. I started one in Philly, and we had a project. I started one called Culture Works Greater Philadelphia that serves arts and heritage and creative industry. We had a commercial film production company come in that on its for-profit side was a media producer. They did commercials, they did all manner of video and digital media. Next to them, they started a nonprofit enterprise that trained adults in recovery, mostly coming out of the prison system, in film and production skills. And they received money from the federal government, from the Jobs Act, from state and local sources, as well as private philanthropy, to run those training sessions. They then hired those those individuals, while they were being trained, interned on their commercial gigs for compensation. And then once they were out of the program, they were actually hired. Often, it wasn't the only place they could be hired. Once they were out, they were free agents to go present their skills wherever. But often the film company would then hire the folks they had trained as full-time or contracted folks on their job sites. So one was a workforce development program, which fits within the nonprofit sort of tax exempt charitable purposes classification system, and the other was unabashedly a private enterprise. But there was a symbiotic relationship between the two. So the for-profit was able to basically build its own workforce with public subsidy through the nonprofit training program. The for-profit also made direct contributions to the nonprofit and received corporate tax write-offs for that optimized their tax position from a private tax standpoint. And the two together, created a really sort of sustainable and synergistic model for them, where they were basically building their workforce, they were doing social and public good, and they were also on the for-profit side building private equity and ownership and value for their company. So does that help, just as an example a little bit, how these things can work side by side? But they were two separate formations, two separate entities. And in this case, the nonprofit lived under CultureWorks as a fiscal sponsor. So CultureWorks provided its 501c3 and allowed it to operate as a program. And then the for-profit company was completely separate and did its own business. But there were legal agreements, management agreements, partnership agreements between the two that kept them tethered. So it's two separate entities with legal agreements that define how the two are going to work together, if I'm going to summarize it in a generic sense. And
thanks for the example. It helps to make it understandable.
Sorry?
I said thank you for the example. It helps to make it understandable. Now, inside of that, you also mentioned that there was a fiscal sponsor as well.
Yeah, so the fiscal sponsor was really providing the nonprofit umbrella for that nonprofit side of their activities. So they didn't have to go out and start a whole new nonprofit. Fiscal sponsors are basically a plug and play access to nonprofit infrastructure. You retain pretty much all the control over the front end of things, your brand, your identity, your customer and donor relations, what you do for work, that remains your prerogative. The fiscal sponsor is there to make sure the back office stuff is happening: compliance, finance, HR, legal. It's very much akin to like a professional employment organization, if you want to use that analogy, where you can outsource your HR to another company and they take care of that, but you retain purview over those employees. So I mean, there are a lot of resources online about fiscal sponsorship, but it's basically an alternative to starting your own independent nonprofit from scratch. It's a much more efficient sort of plug and play, ready at hand solution. So that's what they used. They could have formed their own nonprofit and done that the way most people do from scratch. That totally would have worked as well. They just happened to use a fiscal sponsor instead. So
that was 3 different relationships that were combined together. Kind of,
yes, in a practical sense, yeah.
Okay, so the fiscal sponsor gets money from that other group. That's how the fiscal sponsor makes its money.
Correct. Yeah, there's a percent of revenue charged. It's sort of it's almost like a tax model that fiscal sponsors allocate to cover those back office costs. Ranges depending on how many services you're receiving, from between 3 or 4% up to 15% of income. And for that, you basically get full charge accounting and financial management, legal, HR, all of your compliance taken care of, and basic insurances. That's the traditional package for a fiscal sponsor. And there are a handful of those types of organizations in Philly, as I mentioned. It's a type of nonprofit activity.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other comments or questions, or things that remain head scratching? I know that was a lot of information in a short ride.
Hi, I love that you mentioned about the nonprofit is the cooperative open sourcing. Because I am working with a team, we want a hackathon, and we're in the process of creating a nonprofit because we want to bring out open source technology focused on identity on a blockchain voting app. I came in late. Is this nonprofit focused on creating it in Philly, or is it focused on, for example, Delaware or other states?
Well, so the nonprofit I was just mentioning was I mentioned a few fiscal sponsors in Philadelphia. There are, if you're doing open source work in the tech field, a lot of the open source community is organized under under tax exempt structures because of that affinity. The commenting and the nonprofit world really do sort of mesh well with the ideals and structures of open source communities. There's a big international one called Open Collective you might want to check out, that's actually building an open source financial management software that's for both for-profit and nonprofit work internationally. And they have a fiscal sponsor, a nonprofit foundation that specifically serves collectives in the open source world. And I'd be happy to offline send you some more information on that, but they're relatively new. They're out of Europe, but they work internationally. Most fiscal sponsors, a lot of fiscal sponsors out there work across state lines. So you don't have to necessarily be confined to Pennsylvania or wherever your other efforts are formed. And you can form nonprofits wherever you wish. So if you want to form one in Delaware, many nonprofits form in Delaware for the same reasons that corporations do. They're sort of the most commonized form. And if you want to operate in multiple states, Delaware is a great choice for nonprofits as well. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. In fact, my national organization is a Delaware nonprofit non-stock corporation for that reason, even though I live in Philadelphia. So. I should just on the wealth building and sort of the picking and choosing side for somebody sitting sort of with this question out there. in my experience, just stepping back from all of this, the real decisions often revolve, and as I said, are deeply personal to the individual or the group that's kind of starting the venture, whatever it is. And it comes down, to some of these values. There are people that really, sit in one political economy or the other. But often it really is the goal, the primary goal of the undertaking, to build a private asset or wealth, or something that one can pass to family members or children or descendants or whatever, or is the purpose to do a particular thing that they enjoy doing, that they feel passionate about, that has public benefit, but where ownership is less of a deciding factor, assuming that they're able to earn a good income and make a living and support their family and their life the way they want to live, all of which you can do under a nonprofit. If the decision is more the latter, nonprofit, and you're doing something that can be framed in a nonprofit context as an activity, nonprofit may be the choice for you. If it's really the former, you really want to build private, a private asset, private wealth, private ownership and equity, then you really do need to look at, a private structure for that. And I'll note that if you talk to a nonprofit lawyer, they'll say certain things you can't do as a nonprofit, certain things you can do, which is true in part. But in my experience, and when you look out at the landscape, pretty much anything that is operating in the private world can find a framing that works in the nonprofit world. For example, one of the largest insurance companies for nonprofit, most people think of insurance as a commercial activity. The IRS defines it that way. However, one of the largest insurers out there they only insure nonprofits is a California-based insurance company with $500 million in retained earnings that provides general liability and all kinds of other insurances to nonprofits. They themselves are a 501c3. There are management services organizations and accounting companies. There are legal law firms that are nonprofits as much as there are law firms that are for-profit. So, in my experience, I've not encountered too many, if any, activities that can't be considered or framed in a nonprofit context. What's different is in a nonprofit world, you as the founder or the stakeholders cannot own that in a private sense. It is not yours. It is the people's. But you can earn a living, you can earn a salary, running it, building it, doing whatever you do with it. That's totally legal and totally fine. And being an employee of a nonprofit is no different tax-wise or legally than being an employee of a for-profit. You still have the same employment tax obligations. You can still receive benefits, all of those things. So just wanted to note that for those for whom that might not be clear.
Thaddeus, we had a question in the chat from Mitchell. Any further thoughts about the meta concept of the commons as a limited resource that must be managed collectively, as expressed by Garrett Hardin, and how this concept applies in practice to the present discussion of to nonprofit / commons or not?
Yeah, so great question. I didn't, in the interest of time, I didn't want to go too far down the William Foster Laureate and Garrett Hardin rabbit hole, but my short answer is well, I should say my short answer is, if you want the long answer and the econometric answer, read Eleanor Ostrom, because she was in part, she won her Nobel for essentially debunking Hardin, and thereby sort of laying the contemporary groundwork for common pool resource economics. But just for quick, for those, just to put that question in context, there's a couple 100-year-old notion of this thesis, the tragedy of the commons. Some of you may have heard it. It goes by this moniker. And the tragedy of the commons originated from a scenario like this. Say you have a commons, let's call it a field, and that field is next to a town, and everybody in the town has their own cow. and the desire is to have the cows use the field for grazing. If there's no management or control, the Tragedy of the Commons thesis, would maintain that people left to their own devices will basically deplete the resource until it's dead and gone. Like, people can't be trusted to govern a resource like that. So the idea is that everybody would let their cows graze unfettered, and the field would be decimated in a matter of short time. And Ostrom, in her work, basically used modern game theory, mostly Neumannian and Nashian game theory, and specifically the prisoner's dilemma game, which many of you may know. It comes up in business theory and economic theory. In short, prisoner's dilemma is almost every episode of Law and Order. It's predicated that there are two sort of would-be criminals that have been captured, and the idea is, would they both conspire separately, decide to conspire to save themselves together? In other words, sort of assume a collusion if being interrogated in separate rooms, or would one dime the other out to save themselves? And the prisoner's dilemma game basically says that human nature being what it is, we're liable to save ourselves and not care about the other person. And if we so we'll rat the other accomplice out to save our own life. And that notion has been the long-standing kind of proof of the tragedy of the commons. Ostrom's pushback on that is that governance and rules of management are essential, that the notion of a commons without governing principles or stewardship ideas like bylaws, I mean, these are basically bilegal, notions, if you want to think about a corporation or organization. Without those, yes, things will be decimated, but there is no commons without those kinds of managing principles. And the fascinating thing she did to prove that, she sort of left the math table and said, I'm going to go out and study anthropologically some of the world's oldest commons and try to understand how it is that they remained. And her standard was, it has to be common resources that have been provably, in one form or another, in existence for over 500 years. She wanted to see what has stood the tests of war and famine and nation building and all those things. And she found a bunch of them, most of them natural, so meadowlands in Switzerland, irrigation systems in southern Spain, rice cultivation fields in Southeast Asia. And she went to these places and talked and studied them for about a decade and found that they all exhibited a common set of 8 governing principles or 8 management attributes. And if you look at those 8 principles of commons governance next to basic principles of nonprofit management and governance, they're about the same. And her assertion is that commoning without any notion of governance or rules and succession isn't true commoning. That sort of Hardin's indictment was kind of a straw man, and that all true commons really have strong governance and succession scenarios in place. And so that's basically the more contemporary thinking, and most of the current thinking on commoning and commons is rooted in Ostrom's work from the mid to late 20th century. She died in 2012, but wrote most of her really groundbreaking work in the 80s and 90s. And she started, by the way, working on water management in California. So that was how she got interested in common pool resources. Her first work was how to manage very scarce water resources in the West. I hope that answered the question. That was a lot of obscure theory.
I have a question. You mentioned there the 8 management principles of commons. Are they where can I find them in her book, Governing in the Commons?
You can indeed. I mean, also there are a bunch of websites out there. I think there's actually even a Wikipedia entry for Eleanor Ostrom and those 8 principles. You'll find them right there. I mean, it's literally like 8 bullets, and it's broad strokes, but it's sort of they're akin to the Rockdale principles in the cooperative world. There's a set of principles of governance that were set forth by the Rockdale Equitable Pioneers in the 1840s that are still used as the sort of like, this is the template for how you run a cooperative. But they're very similar, you'll find. A lot of the ideas are pretty parallel. If you get governing the commons, I had to skip the game theory math because that's way above my. Some of the book is actually laying out all these proofs and equations, and you have to kind of. But the nice thing is you can read it without reading all of the formulas. You can just read the text, and it is actually pretty. It's very clear.
Yeah, what you're mentioning is really interesting because I work in the blockchain technology part, where I'm working with a team and also some friends who want to democratize and decentralize technology, especially what's happening in the social media platforms moving forward. We want to have our identity decentralized, owning our own data, owning our own identity, and managing our own credentials. So this is fascinating for me, and I'm sharing this with my friends in the blockchain because we're working on governance on the blockchain. So thank you.
Sure, and I consider the blockchain, all of the various blockchain enabled technologies out there, including cryptocurrency, to be squarely a commoning concept.
Yes, I agree.
Because they exist in a realm of ownership that's really neither state nor private. It's a collective ownership, and not exactly cooperative. Cooperative ownership is usually a sort of more lateral, bottom-up version of private ownership that is also more collective in nature. And again, it's a great model for if that's what you want. But it still is mostly firmly rooted in a private sector of asset management, or a private notion of asset management. There are nonprofit cooperatives as well. My national organization is a nonprofit cooperative. We just don't use the word cooperative because we didn't want to be confused with the for-profit world. But we're something called a Type 1 supporting org, which is essentially a cooperative of nonprofits, if you want to look at it that way. But I think there's also one of the leading contemporary thinkers in the commoning world is a guy named David Bollier, Bollier. And if you go to davidbollier.com, he has a really robust website. And some of his recent books, I think, are real touchstones. He's sort of the inheritor of Elinor Ostrom's work in this area. The nice thing about this is particularly Bollier's work, it's really practical, pragmatic stuff. You can get really esoteric and theoretical, and that's fun. But Bollier's most recent writing is really about how do you kind of put these ideas in practice and make them work in the real world, not just in an academic kind of context. So Ostrom's pretty esoteric, has her practical moments, but Bollier brings it down to earth a lot better, I think.
I thank you for making that distinction between those two people, because my next question had to do with looking at the practicality and simplicity of the business, so that you, especially if you're looking more towards the nonprofit, which is a tax status, so you still need to run as a business and earn money. But I think because of your drive for nonprofit, you're less driven by money. So with that said, kind of like, how do you find the space, the momentum, or even the staffing to be able to do that when maybe everybody in the group is more of the mindset of the work output that you're looking to give to society versus the business that needs to be carried forward? If there's something that you can speak to about that.
Sure. I mean, if I hear the question correctly, it's sort of about roles and responsibilities and how do you operate a nonprofit entity, nonprofits have a staff, they have a board. There does really need to be alignment amongst everybody involved that the nonprofit route is the right route, right? So you want to make sure that everybody's kind of going back to that chart I showed, sort of is clear about the decisions that have been made. This is how we're going to do this work. We're going to do it under this form and this tax status. But beyond that, it's important to gather around folks who can pay some attention to the structures, the bylaws, the ways that you operate. Because we do a lot of I think over exoticizing or making, as much as there are distinctions such as the ones I've laid out, any group organization, for-profit or nonprofit, even a corporation or a partnership that's private, needs its rules of engagement. How are decisions made? Who makes the decisions? When are decisions made? What's the process? Who votes? What constitutes a majority? All these really important things that allow a group to manage together. If you look at a set of bylaws or an operating agreement for most LLCs or LPs, they read very much like nonprofit bylaws, governing bylaws, because they're both just decision-making and management clarity documents. So, with your group, the first step is to figure out how do we want to, how do we want to share decision-making and decision rights and authority within our group over this work? And how do we want to, how can we memorialize that, be it through an operating agreement, if you're in the private side, or a set of bylaws for your board? By the way, staff of a nonprofit can have their own sort of decision-making, agreements and principles. So, first is to come up with how you want to operate, and then put that in some sort of legal container like a corporation, and on top of that put tax status. So just to distinguish, and these often get confused, there's the corporate form you choose, and that's kind of another conversation, and one perhaps better had with your tax attorney or a lawyer. But there are lots of different legal formations like corporations, S corps, LLCs, L3Ps, et cetera. That's one. That's the box that you've built and filed with the state. You apply to the federal government for your tax status if you wish to be nonprofit. Otherwise, you're for-profit. That's their tax status. And then there's sort of your rules of how you work together that are your governing bylaws or your operating agreements. And that's where you can really flesh out, how the thing works together. But it's important to have some folks on the team that care about that kind of structure and organizing work, and are not just focused on the programs and services. Because and that's where fiscal sponsors can be a great resource, because they're there to provide structure to a world that is mostly all about program people, right? So nonprofit world is front to back, all people that just want to do the thing, whatever it is. And they don't want to worry about all this administrative nonsense over here. But it all matters, right? If you're going to do the work well, you need all that other stuff working well too. So fiscal sponsors basically pick up the lion's share of that and give you that structure sort of as a plug and play, versus you having to build it from scratch. But one way or the other, you do need to build that infrastructure to support your organization. And it's the same for business. Businesses need structure and clarity too. So that's not a unique nonprofit thing. That's any group enterprise, right? I've encountered a lot of for-profit businesses that haven't paid attention to that, and they go busto, or there's disagreements between the partners, and lots of drama happens. Clarity on those fronts is really essential.
I have a quick question. What does care wealth mean? It's under your social care wealth.
I didn't. I wondered if somebody would be curious about that. So care wealth is specifically a concept from the commoning world. Its synonym is assets. And in the private world, and an asset in the private world is something that is sort of convertible or liquidatable, right? You can take a house and sell it, or you can take a piece of intellectual property and sell it. Care wealth is something that gets built and then sustained by the community, and is not generally converted or or sold off or liquidated. And it's kind of it's the concept that it's an asset or a resource, if I want to not use the word asset, it's a resource that is built through sort of the care and stewardship of that group. And thus it's sort of care wealth versus essentially private or convertible wealth, convertible assets. And the private sector exists in a very fluid relationship with its assets, right? Assets get bought and sold all the time and things move around. That's one of its characteristics. In the commoning world, you tend to build assets, and you can acquire assets or resources from outside the commoning world. So commons can do business with the for-profit world and government, and they do. Ostrom was very adamant that that's a healthy thing. But once a resource has been brought into the commons, it tends to stay there and get developed and stewarded by that group moving forward. Does that make sense? And so that word arose out of a desire to figure out what is the equivalent of an asset in the private sense in the commoning world, and the asset of wealth.
So if I integrate that to technology, can that be converted into a digital asset?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So like your coding, your IP is a care wealth, is a piece of care wealth or care asset.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, this is all jargony, lingo-y stuff, but it does start to set aside and offer and present different ideas of what these things mean to the group, right? So a piece of care wealth is not something you're just going to liquidate tomorrow to some other private company. It's something you're going to hold on to. Whereas if you were a private company building a piece of IP, you might very well want to sell it. And in many, most startups, they want to exit, right? I mean, that's actually a virtue. In the commoning world, there isn't a lot of emphasis placed on exit or liquidation or things of that nature. That makes sense. And yeah, it's mentioned over here as well. I skipped over some things because I didn't want to take too much time before we got to questions. If anybody wants more information on fiscal sponsorship, there's the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors that you can Google and visit. There's information on my organization's site, socialimpactcommons.org. There's a learning tab with a Fiscal Sponsorship 101 resource there that talks about that if you're interested in that as an alternative to forming your own nonprofit. Just to be clear, you get to do all the same things. You can raise money, get grants, do all the things you want to do. It just allows you to not have to wrestle with forming and going through the federal exemption process and worrying about a lot of things, Pamela, you were asking about, like how do we get all that stuff together? A fiscal sponsor can do a lot of that for you and allow you to do the work that you really want to do on the program side. So, but it's not for everybody. It is a commoning construct. It's basically commonizing nonprofit management amongst multiple independent missions. Did I get a Mitchell? Oh, I see somebody dropped Ostrom's principles in the chat. That's great. Anything else?
Are there any things in particular that you abbreviated and took out of your presentation in order to make sure it was enough time that you think are points you should hit on for us? I'm
happy to. I know we're. I don't know what our. I know we're roughly calibrated to an hour. I'm fine. So if
Yeah, we can keep going until 4:30. So for another maybe like 13 minutes or so, if there are other questions or discussion points, but are going to wrap up at 4:30. That's okay.
Okay. Well, what I can do that might be useful and interesting to folks is just looking at the range of supply finance. If you all aren't familiar with the F.B. Heron Foundation, that's Heron like the bird, F as in Frank, B as in boy. They're a very interesting philanthropy that's working in the social impact investing space, have been for a very long time. And they have this supply of finance model, which is a fancy way of saying where does your capital, financial capital come from, and how can you source it? That doesn't look at at least the capital side as such a kind of black and white, you're either this or that, but more as a continuum. It's really interesting. It's used a lot in the social impact investing world. This is a screen grab of F.B. Heron's scale. And on the left, or I should say my left, your right, we're doing this if I'm thinking correctly, we've got grant support and sort of pure philanthropy. So this is sort of the nonprofit, 100% nonprofit world all the way to the one side. And then all the way on the other side, you've got all of the for-profit market rate ways of obtaining capital, whether that's private equity or commercial debt or private investment, things of that nature. And obviously, as you go to the private equity side, the expectations on rate of return, ROI, are higher. As you go over to the nonprofit side, you get to a place where there's no return expected. The interesting part of this space, personally, and I think this is worth sharing and for us all to think about because it's very underdeveloped as an area of capital finance, is the middle of this spectrum. So we've got lots of stuff on the left, or lots of stuff on private equity side. The nonprofit philanthropic world is large, highly problematic, but large, and it exists. In the middle, there's this realm of recoverable capital. So that's when a philanthropy or a donor might give you the money and want it back with very generous terms and no interest. So basically that philanthropist is saying, I don't want to give you the money as a philanthropic investment, but I'm going to give you a no interest loan with really flexible terms. And all I'm interested in is recovering my capital so I can reuse it. And there's some very interesting platforms in microfinance and other areas that are really focused on recoverable capital. It's basically recycled capital where there's no rent charging, to use the economic term, on that capital, no interest. Then there are things called program-related investments and mission-related investments, which are also, I think, just burgeoning at this point and underused. A lot of social venture can live in the for-profit world, or the nonprofit world, but really can't sustain high costs of capital, can't take out a loan at 15%, can't deliver returns that, say, a private equity or venture capital firm would want. Program-related investment is when a private foundation, takes money out of its endowment, and there are, hundreds of billions of dollars, actually trillions of dollars, that are locked up in foundation investments. Foundations are only required to distribute 5% of their assets a year for their tax exemption, which means that there's this gargantuan amount of money sitting on Wall Street because all those foundations are investing it, of course, in the market so they can grow it, which is legal to do as a foundation. Or the foundation can also take that same principle out of Wall Street and invest it in your business or your organization, and usually at much lower interest than, again, general terms. So most PRIs are between 0.5 and 3% and have very generous terms in terms of what the loan term is and what the loan exit is if things go wrong. So a lot of PRIs are structured to convert to grant if the enterprise doesn't succeed. So instead of having to declare bankruptcy or go through the pain of defaulting on a loan, the funder can simply convert it to a grant and it goes towards their required 5%. So it's like a for-profit lender, a bank writing off a bad debt, but instead of just writing it off, the funder can make it into a grant. And these are there's enormous capital reserves out there that could be put to this kind of use in the social enterprise marketplace through program-related investment and mission-related investment, as well as recoverable grants that are still, there are a couple funders in Philadelphia, William Penn, Barra, have started to experiment with these kinds of loans, but it's early days. And I think if we're the most capital out there to be unlocked for social purpose sits in the middle of the scale. These so-called soft investments and capital protected investments, to use Heron's terms. There's just not a lot of it happening. And I think we need to start doing a lot more lobbying to unlock that kind of investment, because it's an interesting alternative to conventional philanthropy. And I think it's the most appropriate area of capitalization for both nonprofit and for-profit social venture. I have a lot of concerns about the social capital world. I'm thrilled that we're talking about investing not in fossil fuels, but green energy, for example. But when it comes down to like lifting people out of poverty, curing diseases, addressing a lot of the social ills we have, I don't believe that you can get a market rate return and also deliver on those changes societally. I think those are incommensurate economically. And I think you can think you're doing it, but I think if you're earning market or better on an enterprise that is anti-poverty, there's something amiss there. So I think the real sweet spot is this middle piece, which is essentially below market capital. So that's what I this is sort of how that translates. That same scale might translate into the sectors. I'm just sort of roughly imposing capital sources on sector. So this is taking FP Heron's scale and sort of applying it to the 3-sector analysis that I presented. But in a very practical sense, I hope for a lot of folks on the phone, I think this middle area of capitalization is a real opportunity and one that needs to be built. And do check out FP Heron. It's a really cool organization. They've got a lot of great thought leadership on their site.